Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to another episode of Views from the Sister Republic. There's a saying in Swabian, schaffe, schaffe, Häusle baue. And it kind of reflects also the American dream, which often entails the vision of a house with a large yard and maybe a white picket fence surrounding it. But unfortunately, that dream has become a lot more elusive, or at least a growing majority of Americans feel that way. Housing has been one of the dominant issues during the presidential election 2024, with both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris having different ideas of how to get America out of what has been called a housing crisis. But as a Swiss driving through Indiana, seeing all the signs by realtors, seeing the same again happen in Missouri, in Illinois, I've been wondering, what's the crisis really? And looking at the modular homes that we would hardly call homes, really, or houses, been wondering how high can the bar really be to build the houses that are needed for Americans. Thankfully, I have someone with me today who knows a lot more about that and can offer you more than just impressions from driving around the Midwest, and that is Joshua Banduck. Hi, Josh.
Good morning. Good afternoon for you, I suppose, Claudia.
Hello. Josh is a head of policy expert with the Illinois Policy Institute, a think tank that tries to bring market-driven solutions for big government problems in the state of Illinois. Prior to that, he was with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he has also gained a particular kind of government experience because you were a speechwriter. In what departments did you work?
I was a speechwriter in the Department of Labor, in the Air Force, and then for a number of government clients as a speechwriter at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a large consulting firm.
And before that, you were in academia, in the trenches of the world I'm inhabiting. You've been a postdoctoral fellow at very nice places, namely Brown University and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And before that, you were a donor. You got your PhD at the University of Notre Dame. Before that, in your native state, Maryland, at the University of Maryland. Your first book was, I think, based on your dissertation you wrote on Montesquieu. The title of the book is The Politics of Place, Montesquieu, Particularism, and the Pursuit of Liberty. It appeared with University of Rochester Press. And you're looking ahead to your second book, which will come out next year with Simon & Schuster, with the promising title, Get What You Want. But Americans are currently not getting the houses they want, apparently. So what's the trouble with the housing situation in the US? What kind of crisis are we really talking about?
I think the framing that you laid out is perfect, that a lot of this relates back to the American dream. And that American dream, as you sketched it out, is a single family home, white picket fence, 2 cars in the garage, etc., and then a large yard, right? So this is just a space that is yours. And it's a beautiful image. And that was the reality that a lot of Americans experienced in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. And unfortunately, for far too many Americans, that dream for housing, and more broadly, the American dream, looks increasingly like a mirage. Keeping a big picture for a second, every year fewer and fewer Americans believe in the American dream. And I think one of the reasons is that the homes that they want are increasingly out of reach in the parts of the country where they want to live. So that means that the American dream itself is under threat. And if we want to restore it, one thing we need is to solve the housing crisis and to have housing that's affordable, where people want to live, that meets their diverse needs. So big picture, this dream is at stake. Why is it at stake? Well, it's at stake because the cost of housing has went up, especially over the last 6 years, tremendously. If you look at housing data going back decades, it was always a pretty steady increase. And over the last 6 years, we've seen a really sharp increase. In Q4 of 2019, the median home price in America was $327,000. In Q2 of 2025,
so the second quarter, Q being quarter, right?
Yeah, sorry, for the Swiss listeners. So the fourth quarter of 2019, so October until December of 2019, the median home price was $327,000. In the second quarter, so April to June of 2025, the last quarter for which we have data, because we're in the third quarter now, the median home price was $410,000. So that's an increase of approaching $100,000. That's a huge increase. And if you look at the charts, it's a way sharper increase than really any time in American history. So it is the case that housing has got a lot more expensive and incomes have not kept up with that.
What are the reasons for this sharp increase?
There are a number of reasons for it. Part of it is monetary policy, which is to say interest rates. So one of the things that the government did in response to the COVID-19 crisis was they drove interest rates to the floor. And the goal there was to stimulate the economy. One thing that did was made it much, much easier to take a loan out for a home, which meant that at interest rates of, say, as low as 2.5%, people could buy a lot more home than they could with interest rates at, they've been around 4.5%, 5%, or what they are today, 6.5%, 7%, or what they were 30 years ago, which was 10+%. So you can buy a lot more home. And so one thing that happened is that because you could buy more home, more people were buying homes. And when you have more people going after homes, they can offer more money. Suppose that a home was listed at $500,000 and you really want that home, and you run the math and you say, look, at low interest rates, we could afford $550,000, no problem, and we really want that home. So you just offer $550,000. So with super low interest rates, the market heated up and there was not enough supply to keep up with that. And now what's happened is that people got locked in at low interest rates, so 2.5%, 3%. And with interest rates so high today, people don't want to move. They kind of have golden handcuffs in a sense on their current loan, because today you're looking at about 6.5%, maybe a little bit lower based on the Federal Reserve decreasing rates last week. But that means that for the exact same home loan today, say $500,000, you're paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars more per month. So part of it's a monetary situation that essentially created a boom in the housing market, and now people feel stuck. There are also a lot of policy reasons for this, and I imagine that we'll get into that. Based on where you live, it's either easier or harder to build homes. In some places, it's really hard to build homes, and in some places, it's much easier. And when you look at places where it's easier to build homes, generally speaking, housing is much more affordable. And in places where it's hard to build, it's less affordable. And this is just economics 101. When supply goes up, prices go down, generally speaking, as long as demand is relatively constant. And when you have low supply, you have more people going after a small number of goods and prices go up. And that's a big driver, is just low supply.
I'd like to return to the question of why not more houses are built in an instance. But I was also wondering, when you were outlining the monetary reasons for people being now stuck with the homes they bought in the wake of the COVID crisis, to what extent are we still witnessing the repercussions of the 2008 financial crisis? Have these been completely absorbed, or are we also seeing traces of that still?
Great question. And before I answer that, I just want to kind of rewind for a second and put a pin in the way to restore the American dream is housing abundance. So I want to make sure that we focus on that solution, because it's a bipartisan solution. So we'll dive into what some of the problems are. And there is a simple but not easy way to solve this. So we can come back to that. In terms of how this relates to the 2008 crisis, in a number of ways, absolutely. When you think about what people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, what they experienced, the 2008 crisis comes to mind. And a crisis is a scary time. And even just the aftermath of that people were more tentative in making decisions. People lost their jobs, they lost their homes, and that can't help but impact people. In terms of the housing market, what you see when you look at graphs of, say, permitting, which is that a house has to get a permit before it can get built. And you see that after 2008, permitting plummeted, which meant that over time, when permitting goes way down and there are many fewer homes being built, then you don't have the supply that you need. So you can't, in most cases, put up a home in 3 months. It takes a couple of years, oftentimes, at least 1 or 2 years. So when you have multiple years when very few homes are being built, that catches up with you, because 5-10 years later, you don't have the supply that you need at all levels of the market, because homes that might be considered what Americans call a starter home, kind of that first home that you build, that you buy, if those aren't being built, then those people can't get their first home and then move up into a larger home when they have kids. They just need more size. So at all levels of the market, from 2008, you just had things that were not being built. And that crisis arose, at least in part, because of super low interest rates. So different than what we're experiencing now insofar as the COVID-19 pandemic also saw low interest rates, but for different reasons. But that low interest rate fed in the early 2000s lots of people buying homes, many of whom could not really afford to buy homes at that size. And then they ended up defaulting on their mortgages. We haven't seen the same level of defaults over the last couple of years, but rather people being stuck in housing. But interest rates that are extremely low for a long time fuel behavior that, while understandable, does have long-term implications. And for the housing market, there have been some real negative ones that we've, at least a couple of them, already talked about.
I'd like to go briefly back to something you mentioned that is culturally interesting, because we don't really have that notion, and that is what you called a starter home. Because for the majority of Swiss and Germans, you buy one house in your life, if you do buy one or if you do build. So how do we have to picture a starter home? Does it have a white picket fence, or what are the amenities? What do we have to see there?
Yeah, so us Americans, we're a little funny in how we think about housing. And just generally speaking, I think we're much more fluid in our lives. We're more prepared to move across the country, or to move at least across a city, to live exactly where we want, in the house we want, even if that means a long commute or whatever. Europeans, I think, for a variety of reasons, like you said, they, for example, tend to buy a home and then they stay in that home. So a starter home is the idea that, maybe you're young, could be just you, could be just your wife, maybe a small kid. You don't need as much space. You could buy something a little bit smaller. Maybe it's a 2 or 3 bedroom, either condominium, or could be like a small single family home. And then because it's smaller, it's more affordable. So let's suppose that it's a little bit under the median price. Today, let's say it's $350,000. Okay, well, the mortgage payment on that is fine. And you say, oh, okay, well, what we're going to do, we're going to buy that. And then we're going to build up a little bit of equity in the house, because it's going to increase in value. So maybe in 3 years, instead of $350,000, you could sell it for $400,000. And we'll have paid down the principal a little bit. So we will start out, our first house will be smaller. And then in a couple of years, building up equity in the home, we can sell that and use what we sell to buy our next house, which is almost certainly not the last house. Americans buy a lot of homes, but they will start out and then gradually move up the home buying ladder.
Where do modular homes fit into this? Because that is something that fascinates us as Europeans. We don't have anything like this, at least not in the German-speaking part of Europe.
Yeah, funny thing, right? So a modular home being essentially a prefabricated home, right? So you can build this and then plop it down somewhere. So they would fit in places where there's more space. So in a big city like Chicago, it's a little harder to just plop a home down that's prefabricated somewhere. Where there's space in the suburbs and in rural areas, you can just buy a prefabricated home. And essentially, since they're made to factory more or less, think of it that way, it's cheaper to build them. And then they just bring them over and put that down the land, and essentially attach it to the various things like electricity and water. And then you're ready to live there. I guess in some ways, a quintessentially American way to build a home, hyper efficient, and you just install it wherever you want.
I think it's just as American as the so-called shotgun houses that are just these tube-like trailer assembling things that you see in certain parts of America. And I mean, the ease of how these are constructed and how quickly they can be put up makes you wonder why there are not more of those, and why instead we're speaking of a shortage of 4.7 million houses in the US that are needed to satisfy the demand. So you've already outlined that people are struggling to afford houses. They are struggling to upgrade from their starter homes, or they are locked in the market because of interest rate issues. But now we're coming to the question as to why not more is built. So first of all, this housing shortage, how ubiquitous an issue is it across America? Are there hotspots of housing shortage in the US?
The primary cause of this is that the housing crisis is a policy choice, which means that there are policy solutions at the local and state level. I work at a state-based think tank. That means that we focus on Illinois, in particular Chicago, because it's an enormous city, the third largest in America. There are things the federal government can do, and the federal government sets monetary policy, and we've talked about how important that is with interest rates. And housing is primarily, in terms of regulations, how easy or hard it is to build, a local and state issue. So we can zero in on that. That's something that's different from a lot of countries. I'm not sure how different it is from Switzerland, but it is largely a local and state issue. So what are the policy decisions that elected officials make to make housing easier or harder to build? And then therefore, whether there's more or less supply. So there are a ton of regulations that policymakers can decide or not to put into place. The biggest picture is just the overall regulatory environment. So some states are hyper-regulated, ton of regulations. That's Illinois. And some states have relatively few regulations. The state with the fewest, at least per one think tank's metrics, is Idaho. Illinoisans are 7 times more regulated than people in Idaho. That's a lot. And what that means for developers and builders is that when you're regulated, think of it as being constrained. And it's just harder to do things. Everything is harder because there are so many more layers that you have to go through. What are some of the specific housing regulations that make it hard to build? One of the biggest ones is zoning, which basically zoning is what a developer can and cannot build on any particular parcel of land. So this is more of a problem in cities, and I'd like us to come back to the reality that, say, big city housing problems are different from suburban housing problems, are different from rural housing problems. Big city versus small city, they're different. So there's not one size fits all, but rather you identify the kinds of problems that different areas face and therefore the kinds of solutions. So in a city like Chicago, the zoning code, over 40% of the city is zoned for single family housing.
Over 40%?
Yeah, it is illegal to build anything but a single family home there. Only just under 21%, let's call it 20% of the city, is zoned for multifamily housing. That means 2+ units. So even though multifamily housing, 2, 3, 4, 6 unit buildings would fit on the single family properties, you're not allowed to build them. So that's an example of a regulation. Another example of a regulation. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I mean, usually there are reasons for these kind of zoning laws. For instance, aesthetic reasons, or there may be environmental issues. But in Switzerland, we're trying to come away from pure single housing zones. So what is the reasoning behind this high percentage of single family zoning?
Yeah. So I think, unfair way to characterize this debate is NIMBY versus YIMBY. NIMBY means, so this is, for your Swiss listeners, have you ever heard this phrase? Great, I'll explain otherwise. And then I'll tell you why I don't like it, because I think it's more complicated. So NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And this movement is I think, unfairly characterized as, hey, look, I like how things are where I live, and I don't want them to change. So change maybe something somewhere else, but not in my backyard. And then the YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, they say, no, we need more things here, more housing here. I think that it's unfair because oftentimes the quote unquote NIMBYs have reasonable concerns. What are some of those concerns? They're concerned about things like parking. If you live in a single family neighborhood and you put up lots of 2, 3, 4 unit buildings, where are people going to park? You're concerned about infrastructure. You're concerned about schools. So if you just go to Wikipedia and you put in NIMBY or NIMBYism, you'll see a list of like 15 or 20 concerns, and some of them are totally reasonable concerns. The question then becomes, okay, well, even taking these concerns into account, say aesthetic or the character of the community, how do we best address those concerns? So we are advocating for the expansion of what are called accessory dwelling units in Chicago. An accessory dwelling unit, that can be what's called an English basement. So you could turn your basement into a home. A granny flat, say typically an attic where you might create an apartment there and then an elderly loved one could live there with you. Or you might put a little tiny home, modular, prefabricated in the backyard. You could probably fit in our backyard a tiny efficiency little unit back there that someone could happily live in. And that's not allowed in Chicago. And if you want to maintain the character of the community, which is to say that you don't want your loved ones to say it's not affordable and we cannot afford to live here, we're going to leave Chicago and go to the suburbs. We're going to leave Chicago and go to 2 or 3 hours away. We're going to leave Chicago and go to Indiana. We're going to leave Chicago and go to Florida or Texas. If you want to actually keep your community together and close, you need more density so that people can afford to live here. So taking the concerns of the quote unquote NIMBY seriously, I think the best way to maintain the character of the community is to allow density that is aesthetically reasonable, for example, accessory dwelling units.
So to what extent is zoning up to the city of Chicago, and to what extent is that in the hands of the state of Illinois?
The default in America is that localities decide their zoning codes. Now, it is possible for the state to come over the top and say, no. For example, the state of Illinois could, in theory, abolish single-family zoning. They could say no, or they could limit it to a portion of the city. Instead of 41%, they could say, look, no city or locality is allowed to have more than 10 or 20% zoned for single-family housing. So they could eliminate that, and elected officials are hesitant to do so because they do want to be mindful of the concerns of their constituents, some of which are reasonable. I think many of them are misguided, and I understand where they come from. So Illinois, for example, has looked into, and there have been some bills introduced to the legislature to come over the top in some ways and, for example, require that all localities permit accessory dwelling units. They could do things to eliminate other restrictions as well. Some states like California have come over the top because that state has, I think it's safe to say, the worst housing crisis in America. And that is one that is driven by low supply and a ton of regulations, even worse than you see here in Illinois.
Now, we've heard a lot about how to address the housing crisis during the presidential elections that was addressing what the federal state could do. But this was, in a way, also misplaced hope. So to what extent do citizens in Illinois really try to make their state legislature actually act on the crisis?
I think that it has to be driven at the local and state level. And what is it? As I said earlier, what we need is housing abundance. We need as much housing as possible of all shapes and sizes to meet diverse needs. Some people only need a tiny home that would fit in the backyard of my 3-flat. That is, I live in a 3-unit building. Some people want a larger home way out in the suburbs or in a rural area. Great. We need more of all of that to meet diverse needs. And the happy reality is that there actually is bipartisan consensus that housing abundance is the solution. You look at a lot of free market organizations. I work at one of them. We advocate for housing abundance. And then you look at a lot of folks on the left, for example, they call themselves urban environmentalists, people that are really concerned with the environment. And they say, look, we want more density because then people can walk. People can take public transportation more easily. They don't need cars, right? They can bike or whatever. they say, oh, wait a minute, the way to achieve our goals is housing abundance. So lots of folks in the left and right agree on this, which is why I'm really optimistic that we can make things a lot better. And this has to be driven at the local and state level because that's where the lion's share of policy is made.
I think that's something that will come as a surprise to European listeners, that this is actually something where you see hope for bipartisan, not just consensus that there is a problem, but regarding the solution to solve the problem. However, I'm not sure whether an urban environmentalist would really like to work with a free market think tank. So how do you make that marriage happen?
Well, this will give you a little bit of a sense of how I think about policymaking as the head of policy at a think tank. So I think that in our personal and professional lives, we are confronted with a decision every single day. And that decision is, do I want to be right or do I want to make a difference? Being right is easy. As an academic, you can be right by submitting a paper or publishing an op-ed. Same thing with someone at a think tank, right? I can go write a blog post, go on Twitter, X, I can write an op-ed, I can publish on our website, boom, done, move on with life, I was right. That's really easy. And the chances of making a difference with that approach are almost zero. Making a difference is about sharing action and getting things done meaningfully. So how do you do that? Well, when I think about policy issues, I just observe, try to understand what's going on, and then I try to look for common ground and consensus. So one of my big research areas is poverty. And in fact, that's in part how we got to our housing work. And I looked across from the, quote unquote, far left to the far right and saw that within a reasonable spectrum, folks actually agreed on a lot of things, that they observed a lot of the same problems, and they, roughly speaking, had a lot of the same solutions. Because at some level, the data are the data. So to get back to your original question, well, what happens and how do you overcome it? There's this little rascal. I talk about this in the book coming out next year. This little rascal is called why. Why do you think something? So let's then get back to housing, right? So I'm talking to an urban environmentalist or a progressive, which is kind of the American terminology for someone who's like squarely on the left. We say, okay, look, housing affordability, it's a problem. People can't afford homes here, okay? And then we observe that, what's the problem? It's low supply. Okay, yeah, good. What are some of the causes of low supply? Well, it's hard to build here, especially the kind of homes that people want and need. Okay, good. So we've observed. And then what's the shared observations to solve it? Increase supply. And that's, so Governor Pritzker is the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, and he issued a report last fall focusing on the missing middle. And he observed, and he is a Democrat, right? Someone definitely on the left. He would call himself a progressive probably. The problem, low supply. The mayor of Chicago, a self-described socialist, he published a report in spring of 2024 where he identified red tape, that is, for your Swiss listeners, essentially lots of regulations and restrictions, as a key problem. What's the solution in both these cases? Increase supply and reduce red tape. So I don't let why get in the way. So the why would be, well, why do you want more housing? The urban environmentalist would say, well, because I want a dense urban environment and I want to address climate change. And someone on the right might say, well, I want more freedom and property rights. At the most foundational level, I get it. And largely for policymaking, that's irrelevant because we observe the same thing and we have the same solutions. So that little rascal, why? I just try to set why aside as much as possible, and it's effective. And we work with environmentalists in our housing work because we don't let why get in the way.
That's a lovely way of thinking about it. But I like particularly the sentence you said in the beginning, I can be right or I can make a difference. Will making a difference also include improving the public infrastructure when it comes to public transportation? Because I often think, well, housing abundance is lovely, but the housing has to be close to where people work. And looking at all the traffic around Chicago, for instance, I'd rather see a better public transportation network. So to what extent is that part of your solution menu?
Housing and transportation are closely intertwined. So absolutely super important. So I think two parts to this. One is that density helps because what is one of the barriers in Chicago that happily we've been advocating that they address it, and they did, which is amazing, which is called parking minimums. So that each unit built in Chicago used to have a minimum number of parking spaces attached to it. And the problem is that in a dense area, if you want to say build a 50-unit building or even a 25-unit building, and you had to even have a 1-to-1, so 25 parking units, it's really expensive to build that. So in July, Chicago City Council, they passed an ordinance that within 0.75 miles, so for all the listeners that use the right counting system, which is metric, right? That's a little bit more.
That's the right one.
That's a little bit more. It's about 1.25 kilometers from public transportation. Parking minimums have been eliminated.
Oh,
Why is that
wonderful.
important for transportation? Because now I live about a 5-minute walk from what's like a metro, essentially a subway, like an S-Bahn for your Swiss listeners. So I live close to it. Now, if somebody wants to build here, the parking minimums are not a restriction on doing so that people can build more homes by where I live and then have 5-minute walk or 10-minute walk to public transportation. So that's why density is important. On top of that, once you get out into the suburbs, which was part of your kind of broader query here, the farther you get from transportation, the harder it is to have access to opportunity. So if you want to work in downtown Chicago at a good job, but you cannot afford to drive into the city every day and suffer through an hour each way of traffic, maybe you can't afford a car, but you can afford the bus, or you can afford the train or something like that, you need to at least have access to that, which is, again, why transportation and housing are important. You need more housing closer to transportation, and you need a better transportation network where people do live and where they want to live, so they know, okay, well, that area is affordable and all I have to do is hop on the train and I have easy access to the train. That's something that we're starting to think more about, knowing how intertwined these issues are.
Now, neither you nor I can predict the future, but what is your hunch? Where will this discussion on housing affordability, housing supply stand in, let's say, 2 years for Illinois and for America as such?
Every month, almost every family is confronted with a housing bill, whether it's their rent or their mortgage. And it oftentimes is the biggest line item in any family's budget. So people are thinking about it all the time. And it's one of the things that they care about the most because it determines where your kids go to school. It determines what opportunities you have access to. It determines whether you live in a safe or not so safe neighborhood. So people are always thinking about this. And as prices have increased, it's now to the point where people cannot live where they want to live far too often. So this can go one of two ways. Either things can get better or things can get worse. And part of what we're seeing is that people in America are voting with their feet. They're moving to places that are more affordable. They're moving to places like South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, Texas, where among other things, it is easier to build and housing is more affordable. And they are leaving places where housing and life in general is unaffordable. Places like California, places like New York, places like Illinois. So the elected officials, the leaders of states, have to ask themselves a question. Do we want our state to be a magnet where people are excited to move and grow a family and grow a community? Or are we going to be content to have a state where people increasingly say, this doesn't work for me. This doesn't work for my family. As much as I hate it, I got to go somewhere else. And one reason I said I do think this is increasingly a bipartisan issue is that folks, the left and the right in states where people are leaving are really waking up to the reality that we have a big problem here. And if we don't address this, people are going to continue to leave. And both for basic pragmatic reasons and for really big picture reasons about the community, they're realizing they have to do something.
Well, then let's hope that they will do something and not let why get in the way, as you said. Thank you so much, Josh, for giving us insight into America's housing crisis and the reasons why Americans are fearing for that part of their American dream. If listeners want to learn more about what it takes to make a home in America, if they want to learn more about the housing crisis, what would you recommend them to read or watch or listen to?
Yeah, I would flag 2 resources. Selfishly, of course, the Illinois Policy Institute, I think we're doing a lot of great work at the local and state level on housing. And if they want to get a more national picture, I would recommend looking at the American Enterprise Institute. They have a great housing center that really gives you the sort of big national picture, and we use a lot of their data in our analysis.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to dive into for our listeners. Thank you again, Josh, and thank you to all of you for joining us and sharing with us the interest in what it takes to be a homeowner in America. With that, I say thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us, and auf Wiedersehen.
Thanks, everyone.
Grüezi Amerika. Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.